Good evening and welcome to TDM Talk Show. Post-truth has been named the Oxford Dictionary's Word of the Year in 2016. It became a buzzword and has seen a spike in frequency of usage, namely since the Brexit referendum and more so during the US presidential election. Our guest has been studying populism, authenticity and the discourse of Donald Trump. Martin Montgomery is a chair professor in English at the University of Macau. Professor Montgomery, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let's start by delving into this fascinating concept, post-truth. So if we look at the very own definition given by the Oxford Dictionaries as of November 16th, it's an adjective relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So, where do we stand here? Are we truly in a post-truth world?
It certainly feels like it. I think both the Brexit campaign and the American presidential election exposed many instances of propositions that were offered as if true when they were contested and when many people believed that they were lies or falsehoods. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that politics and truth have always had an uneasy relationship. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt actually wrote an article called Truth and Politics, which begins, "No one has ever doubted that truth and politics are on rather bad terms with each other. And no one, as far as I know, has ever counted truthfulness among the political virtues." So I think the difficulty over truth and untruth, if you like, is not new in itself, but there is something rather different about the current period, where no matter how much a truth is becomes a matter of debate and contest, those who are caught out in an untruth seem not to be concerned. And that's certainly a feature, I think, of Trump's way of dealing with an audience or dealing with a public, is basically when difficulties are pointed out in the things that he said, he doesn't become embarrassed or retreat from them. He, as they say, doubles down. And I think those are characteristics of the post-truth era, when those who propose an untruth don't seem bothered when they're caught out. So
in that sense, there's something new, because some would argue, well, it's not really a new concept, but that's where you see the novelty of the situation.
Just to take a couple of examples recently, Trump's inauguration event drew smaller crowds than Obama, as was pointed out at the time. Trump insisted that his crowds were huge, much bigger than the media were giving him credit. And when the media responded by showing pictures in which his crowds were smaller than Obama's crowds, he didn't retreat from his claim.
He said they were being dishonest, crooked media, and even labeling them as fake news outlets, right?
That's right. Or when his spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, made this claim about
alternative facts.
Alternative facts, and that the presidential spokesperson was merely offering alternative facts. This again was doubling down on what was really an untruth.
But let's look at this concept of alternative facts, because it's actually gaining ground and is being a subject of a debate. is it the same, can we put it in the same category as post-truth? Or is it something else, a slightly different shade of a gray area?
I mean, these issues are really interesting because one of the other ways in which we live in a post-truth era is the fact that there are good philosophical grounds for accepting that truth is complex. If you look at the social sciences and philosophy over the last 50 or 100 years, much of it has been about the difficulty of maintaining truth simply on the basis of factual claims. You know, the facts may change, theories may develop, and new facts may challenge old theories, and actually in philosophical areas, it's not that unusual to claim that there may be alternative facts that we need to take account of. So it's as if in the academy and in philosophy and in social sciences, there has already been a recognition of the complexity of truth. And I mean, I can remember as a student some decades ago in which empiricism and logical positivism were challenged by people who wanted a more interpretive view of what constituted the world out there. And we talked about the social construction of reality. So the notion that, you know, one fact stands by itself as true or false within areas of the social sciences is not so easy to maintain.
But would you regard this, the rise of a post-truth world or reality as a sort of symptom of postmodernity?
Yeah. Exactly that. In postmodernity, there was a retreat from what modernity offered, which was a grand narrative about how the world would develop, a sense of progress, a sense of things are getting better because of the application of reason. And what postmodernity, in some guises, challenged was the notion that there was a grand narrative that was leading us into a better future. In fact, sometimes the grand narratives were questioned as regressive and
authoritarian.
Authoritarian, even, exactly. So, postmodernity has a complicated relation to truth. I mean, some philosophers of postmodernity would argue that, you know, it depends what language game you are playing, what will count as true. And I hate to put that alongside these difficult contests in the public sphere between an authoritarian figure who challenges any truth that embarrasses him and rejects it, on the one hand, and put it alongside some of those sophisticated philosophical questionings of modern notions of truth through postmodernism.
Now, coming back to Donald Trump's discourse, he somehow, to his constituency, or would say core constituency, he is perceived as a sincere politician, authentic. So it's way much more based on sounding genuine and sincere, as you pointed out in your study, than on the basis of truth. And they seem to turn, I would say, a blind eye, some would say, on whether it's truth or not, on the facts. But the fact of the matter for them is that here's someone who's the real thing. No spin, not the kind of politician whose discourse is grounded on a number of advisors, on opinion polls, etc., and also speaking directly to the people, bypassing the institutions, etc., right?
That's very much his rhetorical appeal, I think. That he's telling it how it is, in his own name, from his own position, in terms of who he is as a person, particularly as a successful businessman. So his appeal, I think, is much more in terms of his own qualities as somebody who is prepared to speak with the voice of the people on their behalf, authentically. I'm telling it like it is. I'm not hiding things. I'm not repressing your particular views of the world. I'm on your side against the elite and the intelligentsia. And it's more to do with his own emotional appeal than it is to do with appeals to truth. And when he does say something that will be questioned on truthfulness grounds, he rejects the attack and just carries on.
He's also tapping into some sort of anti-intellectualism, which has been looming large. Is not something entirely new, but it seems to be moving towards a more mainstream field of discourse, especially by what we call populist politicians, right?
Yeah.
We don't care what the experts say. Let's say, for instance, in the Brexit referendum, Michael Gove was standing for leaving the European Union, and when he was confronted and when he was asked what most experts say it's not going to be good for the economy and for the country, and he was basically brushing aside any sort of ideas or shrugging off the experts. We are sick, we're tired of these experts.
That's right, yeah. He rejected the experts on the grounds, for instance, that they didn't predict the financial crash. Experts get it wrong, and who needs experts? And I must say, it was quite striking that one of his opponents, who spoke on the Remain side, also invoked, in her appeal to the people to vote and stay, to their common sense. The common sense played an important part, certainly on the Brexit side, but also on the Leave side at times.
Which has been labelled by some as Project Fear. So the Remain camp, what they got to offer, well, especially, let's say, Cameron or some other leading figures from the Remain camp was be afraid, be very afraid.
Yeah.
But then at the end of the day, Project Fear didn't work out that well, right?
No. I think, and it's interesting to compare it with the American situation, because Project Fear worked out very well for Trump. I mean, Trump's inauguration speech is full of references to the carnage America is going through, from immigration, from breakdown in law and order, from drugs and so on. And he's going to fix it. So it's quite interesting contrast to make between the American situation and the role of fear there, and the British situation and the way in which the Remain argument could be labelled Project Fear. I think there's a real difficulty in modern democracies about the role of experts in a democracy. On the one hand, democracy offers in its ideal form one person, one vote, but sometimes about hugely complex issues. And the great difficulty with the Brexit debate was the hugely complex issues around globalization, trade, the democratic institutions of the European Union, whether they're democratic enough, and so on, got reduced to the simple question of do we stay or do we leave? And for the sake of achieving a clear result for the Conservative Party, the ruling government party, it was narrowed down to that single issue in order to get a clear result. But actually, all it creates is mayhem and difficulty. For one thing, the vote was very, very close. So post-Brexit, there's a lot of claim on the part of those who want to leave that this was a decision by the people. And yet, of course, when you look at the figures, the people amount to something like 48% who wanted to stay and 52% who wanted to leave. So it wasn't the people as a whole who reached this decision on a very complex issue. They were divided on this complex issue. And having reached that simple result, we're now faced with huge complexity. I don't know where you. I was kind of interested to try and go back to the Trump situation.
And actually, now that you're talking about complex issues, and what is also very interesting when you look at Trump's political discourse, it's his low scores for lexical density, as you mentioned it.
Yes.
Frequent use of intensifiers, really very, very short phrases. Yeah. It's not actually like a complex idea expressed in a couple of two sentences. You don't even have subordinate clauses in many cases. It's just tweets.
Yes.
And it works.
Yeah. Well, it's part for him of an oral style. I think I would like to put the tweets into a separate box, so to speak. But his campaign, conducted through a large number of campaign stops, many speeches, many rallies, was really an oral campaign. It was oral performance, it was speech making. And in those speeches he used a particular kind of simple oral style, which does require, or is based upon, an awful lot of repetition. He repeats phrases over and over again. Not necessarily the same phrase, but every sentence that he produces. It usually consists of the repetition of one phrase identical to a previous one. So it's a kind of, it's a well-worked oral performance, but when we start to look at previous discussions in the sociological and sociolinguistic literature of working class speech, we find similarities with Trump's oral performance. It seems that he's been able to kind of ventriloquize a working class rhythm. He's adopted a kind of people's vernacular, even though, of course, he had a good education, even though he comes from a very wealthy background. His style of speaking, it seems to me, has assimilated that of the working class very successfully. So much so that I would say he talks in a restricted code. He knows how to use the restricted code effectively for the audience that he was appealing to. And we must never forget that he identified a very specific kind of audience. He won through appealing to a very specific kind of audience. And it was white, working class, male, without college education. And I think his style of speaking was very well matched to that particular audience. There's not a style of speaking that is strong on things like truth and complex argument and elaborate discussion. It's a style that is basically direct, straightforward, immediate, and also depends very much on his own character.
And if we look at the others, when you look at, let's say, from the Democratic Party side, in the primary we had someone like Bernie Sanders, which of course is in way different from Donald Trump in many ways, but they share a couple of similarities in the sense that Bernie Sanders' platform was pretty much anti-establishment as well, though differently, of course. His kind of approach was also relatively down to earth and straightforward, more complex, but I would say he would be closer to the working class people, especially white working class, way more than Hillary Clinton. So there is some sort of belief probably by the Democratic Party or the left of the Democratic Party that there should be a sort of populism of progressives somehow to counter the right-wing populism. And this would, of course, be a broader discussion. But my point has to do with a way to somehow cut the crap, as they may say, and speak directly to the people, also from the other side of the political spectrum.
Yes, definitely you can have a populism of the left just as much as you can have a populism of the right. I think the difference between, I hope the difference between the left and the right is that the left
is inclusive, tends to be more inclusive.
Yes. You need a base. You need to have an authentic voice to reach a core. But one of the things that was very noticeable about Obama, for instance, who was a great speech maker, was how inclusive he was. His speeches would work from we, the audience, we, my fellow campaigners, and so on, to we, the people, to we, the American people, to we, people everywhere. What we want is a better life for everybody. And that's not really the pitch that Donald Trump has. I would hope that you people on the left can find some way of reaching a core with an authentic voice, but doing so in such a way that they are inclusive about the larger society. The problem with people like Trump is their appeal rests upon finding a scapegoat. Who we are for Trump are the people who have been forgotten, who have been left behind by globalization, and we have suffered the presence of people amongst our midst who have taken away our jobs, who have undermined our social services and so on. And that is a very similar appeal on the right, whether it's in the UK or in America. I'm sure that's the appeal of Marine Le Pen and also of other right-wing authoritarian politicians in the present time.
And there's this anger against the so-called liberal establishment, the mainstream media, and political correctness. And actually this is a key point.
Yes. I think in Trump's case, I think political correctness is a way, offers for him a kind of example of the way in which the liberal elites, the political establishment, those who have been successful under globalization, have made life difficult for ordinary people, even to the point of regulating their speech, of saying there are some kinds of things you can say and some kinds of things that you can't say.
Otherwise, you are part of a sort of basket of deplorables, as Hillary Clinton said.
Yes.
In this,
that was a bad move. Yeah.
It fired back heavily.
Yeah. But you mentioned Bernie Sanders. I think it's also useful to draw the comparison between Bernie Sanders on the left in the US and somebody like Jeremy Corbyn on the left in the UK. Because although they're very different people with very different personalities, part of Jeremy Corbyn's astonishing appeal to his core is exactly that. He is saying the things that were not being said by opposition parties under the Tories, that the UK went through a decade, or nearly a decade of austerity measures, and nobody was speaking for the people who were being left behind in all of this. And the reason why he's gathered strong support on the left is he comes across as an authentic guy who's saying the things that have not been said before and saying them in a simple, ordinary, direct way which connects with people's sense of what is wrong. So on both the left and the right at the moment, we have people who are succeeding in one way or another because somehow they cut through the crap. Mm-hmm. You know, they actually tell it how it is. I think the problem in Britain with Jeremy Corbyn is he doesn't know how to transcend his core, his base, his precise appeal is to a certain group, and he has no capacity to transcend his appeal to that group by offering a vision that goes beyond that group to the whole society. I mean, he's very strong on things like workers' rights, and of course workers' rights need to be protected and so on. But as soon as he foregrounds that as a major plank in his political stance, it sounds as if he's only speaking to a fraction of the population, however important that fraction is. But there are great similarities between the basis of the appeal of a figure like Trump and the basis of the appeal of somebody like Corbyn or Bernie Sanders.
Another similarity.
What we're looking for is somebody who, I don't think either of them, I don't think Corbyn will ever win an election in the UK. I think the Labour Party is doomed under his leadership, unfortunately, sadly. I don't think Sanders would have won in the US. There needs to be a kind of way of articulating the needs of the poorer part of the population.
Do you see this phenomena, just like Trump, Sanders, Corbyn, Podemos in Spain? Mm. So I don't mean to put all in the same kind of basket, but we are drawing some and look at some similarities in the sense of the need, a sense of anti-establishment sentiment, and some level of populism. But do you see this as a sign that neoliberal globalization has failed, or this is like the evidence that the globalist, as they call it, elite, has failed to deliver progress and prosperity as an outcome of neoliberal globalization?
Yes. I mean, the amazing thing that's happened in the last year is the way in which that consensus around neoliberalism it's either collapsed or is under complete threat. If you think of, say, Trump as being on the right and Sanders on the left, or if you think in Britain of Nigel Farage and the UKIP party, or Boris Johnson and the right wing of the Tory party being on the right and Corbyn on the left. There's nothing. The middle has gone. The space in the middle has gone. The space in the middle that was basically the space occupied by Clinton and by Tony Blair, where basically they accepted the core tenets of neoliberalism, and their kind of approach was, we need to manage the worst effects of neoliberalism through the state. The state was to be a kind of bulwark or protection for the worst effects of neoliberalism, on the grounds that, nonetheless, neoliberalism could deliver more than any other game in town, so to speak. There is no sense at the moment that that middle is viable anymore. And I think Trump is an extraordinary phenomenon in the way that he's actually upturned so many of the tenets that people have lived with, especially in the political realm, for the last 10 or 15 or maybe 20 years. We used to talk in the UK when Thatcher arrived, is that she'd broken the consensus. In the UK, the consensus after the war was the welfare state, the state as an instrument to protect people, to provide a safety net, and so on. The National Health Service was the jewel in the crown of the welfare state. She came along and she said, "There's no such thing as society. There's only the individual and their families, and there's no such thing as a free lunch. People have to work." She had a kind of aggressive free market approach to economics, and she broke the consensus that had existed since the end of the Second World War. Well, Trump, in a month, has broken the consensus that had been established after Thatcher, which was around neoliberalism.
And free trade.
Yeah. I mean, in all sorts of ways, the repeal of Obamacare, practically everything he's done since he assumed office has been quite precisely in line with what he promised he'd do, but it's basically an attack on that middle ground.
And before we wrap up our talk, I'd like to briefly address the issue of the role of the media. Critics say mainstream media didn't see it coming. They were playing down the odds and the possibility of having Donald Trump as the winner of the Republican primary, let alone the U.S. election. And even Sanders. Sanders was regarded as a sort of an epiphenomenon which would eventually soon, back then, fade away. And Jeremy Corbyn at the beginning, he was regarded as, well, is the leftist that you can get in the Labour Party, and there's no way he can win the party. And then what we had was something else. They didn't see it coming, they say. So they argue that mainstream media, there's a disconnect between mainstream media and Joe the Plumber and the real people on the street. What do you make of all this kind of discussion in a nutshell, if possible?
I think that's just a really good question, and I don't think there's any simple answer. On the one hand, people will say that polling has become much more difficult. There are things to do with the way polling used to be conducted using landline, and the rise of the mobile phone means you get a different kind of constituency. There are all sorts of complications in the polling. But clearly, the polling on both sides of the Atlantic was way out.
Yes.
And you've got these people who are very, very sophisticated polling experts with sophisticated mathematical models like Nate Silver, you know, who was less badly out than some of the others, but was still way out. Now feeling completely confused. But I think that basically one of the ways in which people like Saunders, Corbyn, Trump, and so on have been right is they have plugged in more directly to what ordinary people have been going through, and they've been prepared to speak out in one way or another. And I think one of the, you know, Trump is a very dangerous development, but on the other hand, the capacity of a vigorous campaigner to reach out to people, despite what the media are saying, I mean, despite what the commentariat are producing as analyses, is very interesting. And I don't think we have a model for explaining how that has happened. Because, in my opinion, and I don't really have, you know, scientific evidence for this, but I don't think the social media have been quite as important as people have been saying. I think what has really made the difference is somebody coming along and saying, the world is an unequal place. The only people who have really benefited from neoliberalism, the only people who came well out of a devastating financial crash, have been the people who caused it. We live in a vastly, terribly unequal world, and there is a load of people who were left behind, and nobody has been speaking for them. And
that is a very compelling narrative.
It is, but it's one that they managed to project in person. So I actually feel about the present moment rather differently than those who spend a lot of time discussing the role of the social media and the internet. I think there's still a place for the person who can speak to large audiences directly in a voice that they understand. And it's really unfortunate that Trump managed to do it.
Professor Martin Montgomery, thank you very much for joining us. Such a fascinating talk.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure to have you on. Thank you. And to you at home, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back next week.